Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. It started on a quiet Tuesday night. Nothing unusual had happened that day. I made dinner, fed my cat, and let the TV run in the background while I scrolled through my phone in bed. It had become part of my nightly routine. Scroll through social media until I felt sleepy enough to drift off. I wasn't looking for anything, just passing time. But then I saw it, right between a post from my coworker about her dog and a meme from my cousin. There was a notification. Melissa Carver sent you a friend request. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. A bot, maybe. I even laughed a little under my breath. That name? It rang a bell, but I couldn't place it right away. Melissa Carver. Stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. The profile picture was blurry, but it looked like a girl standing outside in a yard. Dark hair, pale skin, a simple blue HOODIE. Then it hit me. Melissa Carver. It's the girl who disappeared from our neighborhood when I was a kid. I hadn't thought about her in years, maybe decades. She was just gone. One of those stories that never had an ending. A missing girl whose photos stayed on bulletin boards and the side of milk cartons long after the news moved on, and now she was sending me a friend request. I sat up in bed. My heart started to beat a little faster, and not because I was scared. Not yet. More like a weird, creeping curiosity was stirring inside me. I tapped on the profile. It opened slowly, like my phone itself was unsure. There wasn't much there. No friends, no posts, no background info. The photo, that one blurry picture, was the only thing on the page. But what really got me was her face. She looked exactly the same. Not aged well, not same person. Older now, exactly the same. Like she hadn't aged a day since 1996. That was almost 30 years ago. I stared at the photo for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was an old photo, I told myself. Maybe someone had made a fake profile using her name and face as some kind of twisted joke. But even that didn't sit right with me, 'cause I knew that picture. I had seen it before. It was the same photo that used to be on the missing posters stapled to the telephone poles in our neighborhood. The same photo that hung on the bulletin board at the local grocery store back then. Same hoodie, same blank stare. She was 10 years old in that photo, and now someone had created a Facebook profile using it. I looked at the name again. The spelling was right. The middle initial was right. I even remembered the way her last name looked printed on those flyers. CRVR. I don't know why I was so shaken. But something about it didn't feel like a prank. It didn't feel like a scammer or some random person trolling for clicks. It felt personal, like someone had reached out from the past and tugged on a thread I had forgotten even existed. I backed out of the app and locked my phone. For a while, I just sat there in silence. The room was dark, except for the soft hum of the TV. My cat had curled up at the end of the bed. Outside, the street was quiet, like always, but something felt off, like the air had shifted. Like the walls were listening. I tried to tell myself. It didn't matter. It was just a weird coincidence. People get weird friend requests all the time, right? But the name Melissa Carver stayed in my mind like a splinter. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that summer in 1996, how the neighborhood had changed overnight when she vanished. How people started locking their doors more often. How parents stopped letting their kids walk to school alone. How the search parties went out every weekend, combing through the woods with flashlights and dogs and walkie-talkies. And how, eventually, they just stopped. She was never found. The official story was that she vanished walking home from school. No signs of a struggle, no suspects, just gone, like a puff of smoke. Her house was a few doors down from mine. Okay, remember the porch light? Stayed on every night for a year after she went missing. Her parents never moved away. Not at first, but they were never the same again. After a while, they faded out too, quietly, like shadows. And now, nearly 3 decades later, someone, claiming to be her, had found me. I picked up my phone again. The notification was still there. Friend request from Melissa Carver. I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over the accept button. I didn't press it. Not yet. Kinda, I just kept looking at her face. I couldn't tell if she was smiling in the photo. Her lips weren't quite right for a smile, but they weren't a frown either. Her eyes looked distant, like she was staring past the camera. Okay, past me. I finally closed the app and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. And the whole time I was lying there, one quiet question kept repeating in my head like a whisper. Why me? I guess to really understand why that friend request shook me so deeply, you'd have to know what our neighborhood was like back then, before everything changed, before Melissa vanished, before we all grew up and moved on, pretending nothing ever happened. Was the kind of place you only see in old family movies, the kind with picket fences, 4th of July cookouts, and rows of bicycles left carelessly on front lawns because nobody ever worried about things getting stolen. Everyone knew everyone. You couldn't ride your bike more than a block without someone waving at you, asking how your parents were doing, or offering you a popsicle if it was hot out. Summer days stretched forever, and school always felt far away. We had this loop of Street Cedar Lane, Poplar Drive, and Willow Circle that all wrapped around the small wooded patch we called the lot. Even though nobody really knew what it was supposed to be. Some kids said it was an old farm. Others said it was leftover land the town never developed. Had narrow dirt paths, rusted fence pieces half buried in the soil, and trees that were always just a little too quiet. But it was ours. We built forts there. We played hide and seek until dusk. Melissa lived on the edge of Cedar Lane, right where it curved near the woods. Her house was 2 stories, white with green shutters, and always looked kind of lonely, even when people were home. I didn't know her well. Not really. We're both kids, 10 or 11, maybe 12. I can't remember exactly, but I do remember. She was quite polite, but always sort of looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone to be standing there. She had long, dark hair and always wore this blue hoodie, no matter how hot it got. The other kids used to tease her for it, but she never reacted. She'd just keep walking, hands in her pockets, eyes down, like she'd learned a long time ago that saying nothing kept her safest. Her family didn't talk to people much, either. Her dad, I barely saw. Big guy. Worked night shifts, I think, because his car was always gone at odd hours. Her mom, well, I'd see her watering the lawn sometimes, but she never looked anyone in the eye. They kept to themselves. Their curtains were always shut, even during the day, and if you knocked on their door for Halloween, they never answered. Still, Melissa would sometimes join us if we were playing something simple like hopscotch or tag. Never for long. It's just a few minutes. Then she'd leave again, always saying, "I have to go back now," like it wasn't a choice. One day, she was just gone. That was it. I remember it like a movie scene, blurry around the edges, but sharp in the middle. The news said she left for school, like always, walked down the hill past Poplar and crossed by the deli. Someone saw her near the edge of the lot, and then nothing. No witnesses, no screams, no sign of a struggle. Her backpack was found near the woods 2 days later, soaked from a rainstorm, with one strap torn and her math book still inside. I remembered the way. The adults panicked. We weren't allowed to go anywhere alone anymore. Search parties formed almost instantly. My dad was out there every night that first week, carrying a flashlight and a walkie-talkie and looking exhausted every time he came back. Helicopters circled overhead. Police dogs sniffed through the brush, but nothing turned up. And some people thought she ran away. This whispered darker things that someone took her, that it had something to do with her family, that maybe her dad. Well, no one said it out loud, but they thought it. It didn't help that he disappeared not long after she did. I remember his car being gone one morning, and nobody saw him again. Her mother stayed behind for a while, but she stopped coming outside. The porch light stayed on all night, every night. You could see it glowing through their curtains like a quiet candle waiting for someone to come home. A few months later, a for sale sign went up. New people moved in, and the world kept turning, but not for all of us. There was something about losing someone so young, so close to your own house, that left a mark. A few of the neighborhood kids stopped talking about it altogether. Others wouldn't go near the lot anymore, even in broad daylight. And slowly, Melissa Carver became a ghost. Her picture stayed up in the grocery store for years, yellowing with time, the corners curling in from tape and dust. Her smile never changed. It became this quiet reminder, this hole where a person should be that never got filled. And the weirdest part is, as time went on, most people stopped asking questions. Like forgetting her was easier than not knowing, but I never really forgot. Not completely. There were moments, sure, when her name wouldn't come up for months, maybe even years. But then I'd hear a news story about a missing person, or a scream in the woods during a late night walk, and I'd remember her face. That blue hoodie, those eyes that always seemed a little too scared for a kid. And now, here I was, decades later, sitting in my dark bedroom with that same face staring at me from a glowing screen, asking to be let back into my life. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel, but I knew one thing for sure. Melissa Carver was gone. Everyone said so. The police, the news, the families. She had vanished in 1996 and never came back. Her name was now sitting in my notifications, asking for me to accept her. The next morning, I woke up with that strange weight still sitting on my chest. It's like something had crept into my room during the night and perched itself just above my lungs. I reached for my phone before even opening the curtains. There it was, a friend request, still waiting for me, sitting quietly at the top of the screen like a question I didn't know how to answer. For a long time, I just stared at it again. Her name, that same photo, Melissa Carver. It didn't feel any less weird than it had the night before. In fact, it felt heavier now, more real in the light of day. I tapped the profile again, opened, slowly, like before. But now, I was looking closer, scanning every tiny detail, searching for something, anything, that would make it make sense. But there was nothing. No posts, no bio, no about section, no friends. It's just that one photo. It looked like it had been taken recently, and yet it was clearly her, and it was clearly her at the exact age she'd been when she vanished. 10, maybe 11. Standing in someone's backyard with overgrown grass behind her and some old wooden fence that looked like it might fall over in a stiff wind. The photo wasn't high quality. There was something almost digital about it, like it had been run through an old scanner. It's quizzing. In her eyes, they weren't red from flash, but there was something wrong with them. No light, no reflection, just dark, blank eyes, looking straight ahead, like she wasn't looking at the camera at all, but through it. I checked the page again. No activity, no likes, no photos, no comments. It didn't even list a location or school. The account had been created recently, according to the metadata at the bottom, just 3 days ago. That alone gave me chills. Why now? Why would someone go out of their way to create a fake account for a missing girl from nearly 30 years ago and then send a request to me, of all people? I wasn't her best friend. I barely knew her. We lived near each other, sure, but we hadn't even gone to the same elementary school. So why me? I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't targeted at all. Maybe whoever made the account was sending friend requests to everyone who had lived in the area back then. I went down the rabbit hole. I clicked through my mutuals, typed Melissa Carver into the search bar, okay, and checked if anyone else had been contacted. Nothing. No other accounts. No posts about her. No mentions. It was like this single profile existed in a vacuum, touching only me. I even Googled her name again, just to see if maybe something new had come up, a news story, a podcast, anything. But the most recent article was from 2013, a local cold case series that did a short segment about her. It was mostly facts I already knew. The day she went missing, the old photo, the dead-end search, and then silence. The author had tried to interview the mother, but she had passed away years earlier in a different state, alone. The article ended with one of those lines that sticks with you. Sometimes people don't just vanish, they're erased. I kept coming back to the profile picture. I zoomed in. Her hoodie had dirt on the sleeve. Just one sleeve, the right one. I thought about the old flyer again and remembered something odd. Back then, they used to say that when they found her backpack, it had a small tear on the right strap. Could be a coincidence, sure. But the more I looked, the less coincidental it felt. The image looked too specific, too exact. I took a screenshot. I didn't know why, just instinct. Something in me said I might need proof later. Then, without thinking, I clicked accept. The screen blinked. For a second, nothing happened. No message, no changes. Just her name moving from request to friend. And then, right as I was about to put my phone down, a message appeared. It was short. Just one word. Help. That was it. Oh. No punctuation, no context. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply. I didn't know what I would even say. Was it a joke? A sick one? Or was someone genuinely reaching out to me, pretending to be a dead girl, asking for help in some strange, cryptic way? I went back to her profile to see if anything had changed. Still nothing. Still just that one photo. But now, something in the background caught my eye. That wooden fence behind hers looked familiar. The pattern of the slats, the way the top was uneven, with one broken post sticking up slightly higher than the others. I'd seen it before. I was almost sure of it. I got up and looked out my window. Okay, the house 2 doors down, the one Melissa used to live in that yard, had a fence just like that. Old, gray wood. One broken post near the corner. It's the same exact angle. It couldn't be. I pulled up the photo again, compared it side by side with what I could see from my bedroom window. It matched perfectly. That photo had been taken recently, in her old backyard. Someone had taken a picture of her, or of someone pretending to be hers, in the exact spot she used to play before she disappeared, which meant someone had been there. Recently, I felt my mouth go dry. The house was owned by a new family now, a couple with 2 kids. I didn't know them well. Cool. Just waved when I saw them walking the dog. Cool. But now I couldn't stop staring at their backyard, wondering if they even knew who used to live there, wondering if they had any idea what might have been taken in or out of that house over the years, and most of all, wondering if they'd seen anything strange, anything like a girl in a blue hoodie standing still in the yard, staring at nothing. I didn't know what to think. My hands were cold, even though the room was warm. My heart was thudding in a slow, confused rhythm. I didn't reply to the message. I couldn't. Not yet. I just turned my phone over, screen down, and sat on the edge of the bed. That single word echoed in my head, over and over. Help. I didn't know if I was dealing with a scam, a cruel joke, or something else entirely. But I knew one thing. Someone really was pretending to be Melissa Carver. They knew more than they should. And if it wasn't a prank if, this really was her. Somehow, then something deeply wrong was happening, and it was only just beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about her house. After that message, after seeing that photo, I spent the rest of the day walking around in a haze, doing things without really doing them, pouring coffee and forgetting to drink it, opening the fridge and not knowing why. My brain kept going back to that fence, to that photo, to that one word, help. It wasn't just the word that got to me. It was the timing, the detail. It was the fact that someone had been in that backyard, her backyard, recently enough to take a photo that matched a place I hadn't been in over 20 years. I started remembering little things, not big moments, not full scenes, but flashes. Fleeting memories that didn't seem important back then, but now clung to the edges of my thoughts like pieces of a puzzle I never knew I was supposed to solve. I remembered Melissa's front porch, how the wood always creaked underfoot, even if you stepped lightly. I remembered the bird feeder that used to hang crooked near the kitchen window, always empty, swinging in the wind. I remembered the strange humming sound that sometimes came from their garage at night, low and constant, like an old refrigerator running but deeper, heavier. It used to keep me up when I was little, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, listening to that noise through the open window in summer. But more than anything, I remembered her father. Nobody really talked to him. He wasn't friendly, not rude, exactly, just cold. Big man, strong arms, always wore work boots, even on Sundays. I think he'd worked construction or something similar, but nobody knew where. No one ever saw him leave for work, and no one ever saw him come home. It was like he only existed inside that house. When he did come outside, he didn't wave, didn't smile. He'd just stand on the porch, arms crossed, watching the street. Not in a neighborly way more, like he was guarding something. I remember one afternoon in the summer of '96, maybe just a few weeks before Melissa vanished, a group of us were playing tag near her yard. She came outside and stood on the steps for a moment, like she wanted to join us, but didn't dare. I waved. She half smiled. Then her father's voice barked from inside the house, loud and sharpened. She turned around like someone had yanked a string in her back. She went inside without a word. I remember standing there, frozen, wondering what he'd said. I didn't hear the words, just the tone, hard, controlling, like a command. I also remembered this one strange die. Don't know why it came back to me now. And my friend Jason and I were exploring the edge of the woods behind her house. There was this old shed back there. We thought it belonged to no one, but it was technically on their property. The door was padlocked. We didn't try to break in, but we peeked through the cracks in the wood. I remember seeing buckets, long metal chains, a shovel with dark stains on it. At the time, we thought it was cool in that creepy kid way, like maybe it was where her dad did some weird workshop stuff, or maybe it was just old junk. Okay, but Jason joked that it looked like a murder shed, and we laughed and moved on. We never told anyone, but now that memory sat different in my stomach. Okay, that shed, those chains, that smell. I hadn't thought about it in years, until now. There was another memory, smaller but sharper. One night, right after Melissa disappeared, I was lying in bed when I heard something outside. I lived a few houses down, but sound traveled in strange ways in our neighborhood. This was a scraping sound. Something dragging across pavement. I got up and looked out my window. It was past midnight and the streets were dark, but I saw a shape near the Carver house, a tall figure. Maybe him, maybe someone else. They were pulling something heavy toward the woods. I remember pressing my face against the glass, trying to get a better look. But by the time I'd blinked, they were gone. I never told my parents. I didn't want to get in trouble for being up late, okay? and maybe part of me didn't want to know what I'd seen. But now, as an adult, those moments came back to me like quiet little alarms going off in my mind. I started wondering how much we all didn't see. How many things we looked past because we didn't want to believe something that dark could happen on our street. Melissa was just gone, and her dad, like smoke, vanished too. Some people said he packed up in the middle of the night and left the state. Others said he died in a fire a few towns over, but no body was ever found. No records, no confirmation. It's rumors and whispers and the quiet knowledge that something had happened behind those closed curtains. And now, 20-something years later, she was sending me messages from a profile with her 10-year-old face taken in her old backyard. It made no sense, but it also made too much sense in a way I didn't want to admit. I thought about all the things I never asked back then. I thought about the times we ignored the weird stuff because it was easier to assume nothing bad was really happening. I thought about how fast adults moved on, and I realized something that gave me chills. Nobody ever looked into that shed. Not once. Not the cops. Not the neighbors. Nobody even mentioned it. We just pretended it was a normal backyard tool shed. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted. So maybe Melissa had tried to tell us something, and we hadn't listened. Maybe she still was. I didn't sleep much the night after that first message. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Melissa's face, her 10-year-old face, frozen in that low-quality photo, staring straight ahead with those flat, shadowed eyes like she was still, waiting for someone to notice her. I kept reaching for my phone, opening and closing the app, half hoping the message had vanished or that it had all been a dream. But it didn't vanish, and it wasn't a dream. I don't know. That single word, help, was still there, sitting in my inbox like a quiet scream. I didn't answer her. I didn't even know what to say. But something about ignoring it felt worse, like turning your back on someone stuck in a hole, hand outstretched. I left the house early the next morning, walking around the block just to clear my head. Everything looked so normal. Sprinklers clicked on. A kid on a scooter zipped past me without looking up. Someone was mowing their lawn on the corner of Cedar and Willow, like the world hadn't shifted. I stood across the street from her old house and watched it for a long time. It had new siding now, blue instead of the old white. The windows had been replaced, and the porch no longer creaked. The family that lived there now had 2 small boys, and I saw their bikes leaning against the railing, their helmets still buckled like they'd just run inside for a snack. I kept thinking about that photo, taken just feet from where I stood, about the possibility that someone, whoever was behind that profile, had been in that yard without anyone knowing. I started wondering if it had happened in the middle of the night, or if someone had walked through broad daylight, blending in, invisible in plain sight. I thought again about Melissa's father, about how he vanished just like she did, about the old shed in the back, the one I hadn't laid eyes on since I was 11. I knew it was still there. I could almost picture it slouched and leaning, with vines crawling up its side like they were trying to strangle it. Someone had taken that photo recently. That meant someone had gotten close to that shed again, maybe even gone inside. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hands, staring at the screen like it held some kind of code I was supposed to crack. The longer I looked at her message, the more it felt like a key butt to what I didn't know. I opened the chat. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed, "Who is this?" but didn't send it. I deleted it. Then I typed Melissa, but that felt worse somehow, like I was talking to a ghost and daring it to answer. I finally just sent a single word back. Why? I pressed send, and my stomach dropped as the message disappeared into the void of that silent profile. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I refreshed the page. Nothing. I got up, paced the kitchen, came back. Still nothing. I started to feel stupid, like I was feeding a prank or letting some teenager mess with my head. But then, as I was putting my phone down to go take a shower, a new message came through. 3 words this time. He's still here. That stopped me cold. I stared at those words so long they started to blur. He's still here. I read them again and again. I knew who he had to be. There was only one person it could mean. Father. But he had been gone for almost 30 years. Dead, missing. Who knew? He hadn't been seen since shortly after she vanished. The police had written him off as another missing person. Maybe a runaway, maybe a suicide, maybe a guilty man skipping town. And yet, now whoever was sending me these messages wanted me to believe he was still around, still close, still here. I didn't know what to believe, but I also couldn't stop. Kite, back, where, and hit send before I could think twice. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately, like they were already waiting for me to ask. The reply came a moment later, underneath. That was all. Just that one word again. A teen. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen as a slow, creeping sense of dread filled my chest. Underneath what? The house? The shed? The neighborhood? I started thinking about basements, crawl spaces, the old root cellars a few of the older houses had before remodeling. I remembered that Melissa's house had a basement and finished, cold, always dark. I'd only been down there once when I was a kid for a birthday party. It was dusty and low-ceilinged and smelled like damp earth. I remember the carpet was thin and frayed and the lights flickered even back then. That had been the only time I'd ever seen her father smile standing at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, watching the kids eat cake. His smile hadn't reached his eyes, and now I couldn't shake the image of him standing over something someone buried, just beneath the floorboards. Underneath, I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I was getting Facebook messages from a girl who disappeared before Facebook even existed. That someone using her name had told me her long-missing father was still underneath something. It sounded like a prank call waiting to happen. And worse, what if I was being pranked? What if someone from the neighborhood found out I used to live near her, decided to mess with me, maybe knew some old stories, and was using them against me? But deep down, I didn't believe that. It felt too specific, it's too timely, too personal. This wasn't just some bored teenager. This was someone who knew things I hadn't told anyone, things that were buried both in the ground and in my memory. I kept reading the messages over and over again. Help, he's still here. Underneath, 3 small pieces of something I didn't yet understand. A warning, a riddle, or a desperate cry from someone who never made it out. I didn't sleep that night either. I just sat by the window with the light off, staring down the street toward her house. Everything was still. Nothing moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, somewhere, had started moving again. Something that had been asleep for a long, long time. The next morning came quietly, with gray skies and no wind, like even the weather was holding its breath. I hadn't slept again. Not really. Sat there most of the night with the living room light off and my phone in my hand, staring at the messages, flipping between shock and doubt and something close to fear. I thought maybe the account would disappear by morning. Or maybe I'd wake up and find the whole thing gone. Just some strange dream left over from too many unsolved mystery documentaries and too many nights alone. But the messages were still there. That same grainy photo, that same dead-eyed stare. Help, he's still here. Underneath, I didn't message back again. I didn't know what to say. And maybe a small part of me didn't want to open that door any wider. But curiosity doesn't sit still. It builds, it nags, rolls under your skin. And before I even knew what I was doing, I found myself walking toward Melissa's old house again. It was still early, not even 9 a.m., and most people were still inside, their blinds down, their lives quiet. I took the long way, pretending like I was just out for another walk, but my feet knew where I was going. I stopped across the street again, right near the maple tree I used to climb when I was a kid. That tree had a scar on the side from when lightning struck it years ago. It hadn't changed much, but the house had. New door, fresh paint, different mailbox. It was just a house now, okay? But something inside me still saw it as the place where Melissa had lived and where she might have died. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see. A shadow in the window, a sign. The front yard was empty, just a few toys scattered in the grass and a faded welcome mat on the porch. But my eyes weren't on the house. They were on the shed. Hadn't seen it in decades. And yet, there it was, tucked into the back corner of the yard, like it had been waiting for me to return. It looked even smaller than I remembered, but the shape was the same, leaning slightly to the left. The wood, dark with age and rain. A few vines still clung to the side, like dying fingers. I kept staring at it, trying to figure out why it gave me such a strange feeling. And then, just for a second, I thought I saw something move inside. Not a full figure, not even a full shadow, just a flicker of something. Like someone ducking back quickly, not wanting to be seen. My breath caught in my throat. Blinked. Nothing. The shed was still again, silent and still. But that was all it took. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I waited until the afternoon, when the family that lived there backed out of the driveway and drove off. I stood on the sidewalk, pretending to scroll through my phone until I was sure they were gone. Then I crossed the street and walked up the side of the yard like I belonged there, heart pounding so hard I thought it might echo in my ears. When I reached the backyard, everything felt too quiet. The air was thick and still, and even the birds seemed to have gone somewhere else. I walked up to the shed slowly, each step louder than it should have been. The wood door was closed, but crooked, and I could see through a thin crack running down the middle. I leaned in and peered through. At first, all I saw was darkness and dust. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters, and the floor was cluttered with old tools, paint cans, and boxes. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw something in the far corner, a shape, low to the ground. Still, it looked like a person sitting on a stool with their back to me. My breath caught. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I stared through the crack, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape didn't move. Could have been a mannequin or just a stack of things piled in a way that looked human. But something about it felt off. It's familiar, even, like the curve of the shoulders or the tilt of the head was burned into some deep part of my memory. I backed away slowly and almost tripped over a rake lying in the grass. I didn't try to go inside. I didn't knock. I just left, back to my house without looking back. Once I was home, I locked the doors and sat in my kitchen trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. I kept telling myself it was just junk, illusion, nothing real, but I couldn't get the image out of my head. That still figure, those slumped shoulders, like they'd been waiting in the dark for years. Later that evening, I checked the profile again. No new messages, but the last one underneath felt heavier now, like it had weight to it. I opened the photo again, zoomed in on the background. I hadn't noticed it before, but behind Melissa's small body, over her shoulder, just barely visible through the shadows, was a piece of the shed's door, too, and something else, a blur, a dark figure, barely distinguishable, standing in the doorway. I hadn't seen it before, Todd, but now that I did, I couldn't unsee it. Could have been someone else in that photo, someone watching her, someone standing behind her, just out of focus, like a ghost hiding in plain sight. I sat back and stared at the ceiling, my whole body tense. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew this wasn't over. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And whatever it was, it had never left. It had just been waiting. In the shadows. In the shed. Underneath everything. I didn't sleep again that night. Not even for a second. Kept the lights off in my house. The curtains drawn just enough to let in the dim yellow glow of the street lamp out front. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee that I didn't drink, just holding it in my hands like it would somehow anchor me to something normal. I kept thinking about the photo, about that shape in the background, the blurred outline of a person standing just inside the shed. It's barely visible behind Melissa's small frame. It had always been there, and I'd missed it. It's made my skin crawl to think that this picture had existed for who knows how long. Quietly holding the secret in plain sight, while the rest of us neighbors, family, police just looked right past it. That figure wasn't just anyone. I didn't know who it was yet, but I knew it mattered, And even more than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching. Not just then, not just in 1996, but now, too, watching me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe the shape in the shed was just a trick of the light or a stack of boxes. But no matter how I tried to logic it away, I kept circling back to that message during and then the way. My stomach had dropped when I saw the figure behind her. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police or even the family living in the house now. But what would I even say? Hey, I think there's a ghost or a killer or a 30-year-old mystery hiding in your shed. They'd think I was crazy. I didn't have proof, not really, just a gut feeling and a blurry photo sent from an account that shouldn't exist. Instead, I stayed up watching old VHS footage I had digitized years ago, home videos from when I was a kid, hoping to calm myself down, but instead, I only made it worse. There was one clip I hadn't watched in a long time. 4th of July, 1996. I was 12, and I remember it well because that was the last year Melissa was at the neighborhood block party. Someone had set up a camera on a tripod at the end of the street, probably one of the dads, and it caught the kids playing in the background while the adults grilled burgers and drank beer. I watched as we all ran through the sprinklers and chased each other with water balloons, squealing and laughing, and then, just for a second, the camera caught Melissa. She was standing by herself near the edge of the sidewalk, close to the hedges that separated her yard from the one next door. She looked distracted, not sad exactly, but distant, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Her head tilted slightly, like someone was whispering to her from just behind the fence. And then her body jerked, it not violently, more like someone had tapped her shoulder, and she turned her head fast, looking straight toward the bushes. The footage was grainy, but I could swear her lips moved. Just a few words, like she was saying, "I saw you," or maybe "stop it." But there was no sound on the tape. Then, like it never happened, she turned and walked off camera, and that was it. I froze the frame and leaned in close, squinting at the edge of the video, trying to catch a glimpse of what was behind the hedge. There was nothing clear, just the soft blur of green leaves. Maybe a little movement in the corner. It's like something shifting in the shadow. But again, it could have been anything. I replayed it a dozen times. It always felt the same. Like Melissa wasn't surprised by what she saw. It's more like she already knew someone was there. Like she was used to it. And that thought sat heavier than all the others that maybe she'd been watched long before she disappeared. Maybe she tried to tell someone. Maybe nobody listened. As dawn broke, I finally stood up from the table and stretched my legs, feeling like I'd been sitting for a year. I didn't want to go back to that shed. Not yet, but I needed to understand more. I started digging through old newspaper articles, the ones I'd saved digitally from a research project I did back in college on unsolved local crimes. Melissa's name had come up then, but I hadn't looked too deeply. Now I searched her name directly. Melissa Grayson, age 9. Vanished July 17th, 1996, from the east side of town. Last seen near her backyard around 8:15 p.m. Presumed abducted. The case went cold after a year of interviews, polygraphs, and fruitless tips. No suspects, no leads, nothing. Just a little girl who vanished into the evening air and never came back. I found one article from the local paper, dated July 20th, 1996, 3 days after she went missing. The headline read, "Parents plead for return of missing daughter." There was a photo of her parents, looking hollow and exhausted, and beneath that, a quote that stopped me cold. It was from her mother. Melissa had been scared the past few weeks. She said she saw a man in our backyard more than once. We thought it was her imagination. I read that line over and over until it felt burned into my brain. We thought it was her imagination. They hadn't believed her. I wanted to scream, even though it had been nearly 3 decades. I wanted to go back in time and make someone listen to her, till I couldn't. All I could do now was try to understand what happened, 'cause maybe the account messaging me wasn't fake. Maybe it was Melissa, or something left behind. A warning, a breadcrumb, a cry for help. That afternoon, I walked through the neighborhood again, this time slower, watching everything more closely. The houses hadn't changed much, neither had the people. Some of the same faces still lived here, older, grayer, quieter. I passed Mrs. Kellerman's house. She'd been the neighborhood busybody when I was a kid, always peeking out the blinds, always watching. I wondered if she remembered Melissa. I wondered what she might have seen back then, if anything. I was about to keep walking when I saw her. Not Mrs. Kellerman, Melissa, or someone who looked just like her. She was standing across the street, near the corner where the school bus used to pick us up. Same brown hair, same red sweater. I froze. My heart skipped. I blinked hard. But when I looked again, she was gone. Just an empty sidewalk and the wind moving the leaves. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have, and finally turned back toward home. But the image of that girl wouldn't leave my mind. I didn't know if it was real or just something I wanted to see. But either way, I felt the same thing in my gut, that Melissa hadn't disappeared into thin air. She'd been taken. And somehow, after all this time, she was still trying to come back, still trying to be found, still trying to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, she was never very far to begin with. It wasn't until I started going through my childhood notebooks that the memories began pressing in harder than before. Like old dust finally disturbed after sitting too long. I didn't even know I still had them half-torn spiral-bound journals, stuffed into an old plastic bin in the attic, right next to boxes of faded holiday decorations and my dad's broken fishing gear. I didn't go looking for them. Not really. I think I was just trying to be close to something real, something I could touch and hold, while everything else felt like it was slipping sideways. I found one from the summer of '96, and even though I hadn't thought about it in years, I remembered the way I used to write in it every night before bed. Sometimes I wrote about the neighbor's dog, or school, or what flavor of ice cream I had that day. But as I flipped through the pages, my fingers started to slow down. The entries got shorter, less playful, more observant. There were lines like, "I saw Melissa crying behind her shed again, and she told me not to tell anyone." One night I wrote, "She said, someone's watching her, but she thinks they can't see her when she's in the treehouse." That stopped me cold. I'd forgotten about the treehouse. It had been behind Melissa's house, built by her dad, sometime in the early '90s. A rickety little thing wedged between 2 oak trees. More dangerous than fun, but to us, it was a fortress. I don't remember when it got taken down, maybe right after she disappeared, but seeing those words in my handwriting pulled me straight back to that summer. I could feel the humidity the itchy mosquito bites, the feeling of my sneakers sticking to the wood planks when we climbed up there with flashlights and cans of soda. It was our safe place, and yet that's where she went to hide. What had she been hiding from? I kept reading. Another entry, dated just 3 days before she vanished. Read. Melissa said she heard the man's voice again last night. She didn't say what he said, just that it was close. My stomach turned, and I actually had to put the notebook down and walk away for a second. My own words were confirming something I hadn't wanted to admit until now that Melissa had told someone what was happening. She told me, and I forgot. I buried it. Maybe I didn't understand it at the time. Maybe I was just a kid. But deep down, I think I knew, even then, and I didn't do anything. That guilt, it started eating into me faster than I expected. I went back to the notebook, needing more, needing anything that might explain what we'd missed. One entry, scribbled messily on the inside back cover, stood out. Melissa said, if something happens to her, check the treehouse. She said she left something there. I don't know what. I stared at that line for a long time. The treehouse was long gone. The trees were still there, though still growing behind that same house, even if a different family lived there now. I knew it was a long shot, but I couldn't stop thinking about what might have been left behind. Something hidden, something buried. I waited until nightfall again, like always, and drove past the old Grayson house, slow enough to feel like I was doing something wrong. It looked the same small porch light, still flickering, the same cracked stone path leading to the backyard. Current owners were out, or maybe asleep. Either way, the place looked empty enough. I parked down the block and walked the rest of the way. My heart was hammering in my chest like I was a teenager sneaking out past curfew again. I slipped through the gate on the side, past the hedge where Melissa had stood in that old video, and made my way toward the back of the yard. The trees were still there, thick and gnarled, their limbs twisted into the sky like reaching hands. There was no sign of the treehouse anymore, not even old nails or boards left behind. Just packed dirt, some dry leaves, and a circle of exposed roots. I knelt down near the base of the largest tree and started brushing the surface with my hands. I felt ridiculous. I felt desperate. But I also felt like Melissa was still with me somehow, like she was pushing me to keep looking. That's when I felt my fingers scraped against something hard. Not a root, not a rock. Dug deeper. Small metal tin, rusted and dented, no bigger than a lunchbox. I pulled it out and sat back, my hands shaking. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper, a purple plastic hair clip, and a photograph. The paper was yellowed with time, the ink faded, but still legible. It was Melissa's handwriting. If you find this, please tell someone. He comes at night. He says he knows when I'm alone. He says I have to be quiet, or he'll take my mom too. I don't know what to do. Please tell someone. I'm scared. I read the letter again and again until the words blurred through my tears. She had cried for help. She had hidden her voice in a box under the dirt, hoping someone would hear it one day. And now, almost 30 years later, I was holding it in my hands. The hair clipped bright purple. The kind kids wore in the 90s. Looked like something she'd worn to school. In the photo, ... that was the part that hit me the hardest. It was of Melissa and another girl, me. We were sitting on the swings at the park, smiling at something just off camera, but behind us, blurry again. Always blurry, was the shape of a man, just the edge of a sleeve, hand resting on the swing set frame. I felt like the world narrowed down to a pinpoint right then. The man was always there, always watching, always just behind us, and no one ever saw him. Or maybe no one ever wanted to see him. I tucked the letter and the photo back into the box and held it close to my chest for a moment. Then I stood and quietly made my way back to the sidewalk. I didn't take anything else from the yard. I just left. But I knew then that something was broken in this neighborhood, had been broken for years, and whatever happened to Melissa wasn't just a tragedy. It was a secret, a long, festering, shared silence. And now, with that message she'd sent underneath, maybe she was finally done being quiet. Maybe it was time for everyone else to start listening. After I found the box under the tree, I didn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time. Every creak in the walls, every branch scraping against the roof made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone had been woken up along with the memories. I kept that tin on my nightstand like it was some kind of anchor, something to remind me that this wasn't all just in my head. But it didn't bring comfort, it brought weight. Every time I looked at that photo of Melissa and me on the swings, my eyes would go straight to that shadow in the background, the man's arm just barely visible, like he was always there, just outside of memory. I scanned the image 100 times under every kind of light. The more I looked at it, the more I noticed how unnatural it felt. Like whoever took it hadn't meant to capture a memory. It felt like surveillance. We'd always assumed her mom took those photos. She used to carry one of those disposable cameras around and snap pictures of everything. But now I wasn't so sure. I flipped the photo over again and again. No writing, no time stamp, just that man's sleeve and the white edge of his hand near the swing set bar. The skin looked pale, almost too pale, like the flash had caught him off guard, or like he was already halfway gone. And the thing that started eating at me most was that I felt like I had seen that same figure more than once. It's not just in that photo, but in other places, old class pictures, background shots from school events, even some neighborhood barbecues, always blurry, always half hidden, but always just barely there. I pulled out an old shoebox full of photos my mom had given me years ago. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, just something that might tell me I wasn't going crazy. I started laying the pictures out across my living room floor, lining them up by year. Birthday parties, school plays, Halloween, Easter egg hunts. My fingers started to tremble the further I went back, 'cause in at least 3 of them, 3 separate events, different seasons, different people, I could see that same figure in the background, always on the edge of the frame, always turned just enough that you couldn't see his face, okay? And then I found the one that made me freeze completely. It was from my 7th birthday party. There was a group of us sitting on the lawn, laughing, eating cake, all of us surrounded by parents and neighbors. And near the fence, standing completely still behind the bushes, was a man in a dark jacket. His face was mostly in shadow, but you could just make out the curve of his cheek and the tip of his nose. What chilled me wasn't that he was there. It was that I'd never seen him before, and I remembered that party clearly. I remembered every person who came, but not him. I scanned the faces of the adults in the photo. My mom, Melissa's mom, Mrs. Torres from down the street, but no one seemed to be looking at him. No one seemed to notice. It was like he wasn't meant to be seen. I held the photo up next to the one from the swing set. Same build, same sleeve, same outline of a hand resting on metal. The panic didn't hit me all at once. It came in waves. First disbelief, then the slow dawning realization that this wasn't a coincidence. He had been following us, watching us, long before Melissa disappeared. And I had proof now. I took both photos and the letter from the tin and drove straight to the local police station. It was late, and the building was mostly empty except for the night desk officer and a young deputy yawning behind a monitor. I tried to explain everything, calmly, but I could tell by the way they looked at me that they thought I was just chasing ghosts. I asked if there was a detective on duty. There wasn't. They said someone would follow up with me the next day. I left the photos and the letter with them anyway, made sure they logged them properly. and walked back out into the parking lot, feeling like I had just handed over pieces of my childhood to strangers who didn't care. I sat in my car for a while after that, watching the glow of the street lamps flicker on the windshield. I thought about Melissa and how scared she must have been. She didn't vanish out of nowhere. She tried to warn people. She tried to tell someone, okay? And now I was trying to do the same thing, and still no one was listening. The difference was I wasn't going to disappear, not without a fight. When I got back home, I checked my computer out of habit. The friend request from her account was still there, still sitting unanswered. I clicked into the profile again. Still no posts, no photos, just that one image of the tree behind the house. But this time, something was different. There was a new message waiting. No notification. Just a small, blinking dot in the chat window. I clicked on it slowly. One sentence. Just 5 words. Did you find the box? I stared at the screen for what felt like forever. I hadn't told anyone, not even the police. I had just dropped the contents off and left. The only person who knew exactly what I had found was Melissa, or whoever was behind that account. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't want to respond, but I couldn't not. I typed back 1 word. Yes. The reply came instantly. Then you know who he is. That's when it hit me. It's all those photos, all those memories. He wasn't just some stranger. He was someone we all knew. Someone close enough to blend in at birthday parties, school events, holidays. Someone we trusted. And if Melissa knew who he was, then maybe she had left something else behind. Something even more important than the box. I thought about her old bedroom, about her closet, about the attic in her house, if it hadn't been cleared out. Maybe she left more than one trail. And maybe, just maybe, she knew this day would come when someone would finally start digging, when someone would stop pretending everything was fine. I didn't know where this was heading anymore, but I knew one thing for sure now. Okay, the man in the background hadn't stopped watching. No, in 1996. Not now. He was still here, somewhere nearby. Maybe even waiting for me to look away again. After that message, then you know who he is. My mind raced, desperate to piece together the puzzle that had haunted me for decades, but now felt so close I could almost reach out and touch it. Who was he? The man in the background of the photos, the shadow lurking just out of sight. The one Melissa had feared. I had grown up in that neighborhood, knew everyone, or so I thought, but suddenly I realized there was one name I had never spoken aloud. One man whose presence had always felt like a shadow at the edge of every gathering. His name was Carl Matthews. Carl wasn't just a neighbor. He was a part of the community, the kind of man who helped organize the annual block party, who handed out candy at Halloween, who everyone trusted because he smiled too easily and never seemed to stay in one place long enough to be noticed. But beneath that friendly face was something else. Rumors whispered between parents about him, about how he was quick to anger, how some kids had gone missing in other towns he had lived in, how his eyes seemed to flicker with something darker when he thought no one was watching. The police had interviewed Carl back then after Melissa vanished. He passed their tests, gave solid alibis, and slipped back into the background as if nothing had happened. But I remembered seeing him once, just weeks before Melissa disappeared, near the shed in her backyard, his silhouette outlined by the setting sun, standing perfectly still, watching the house like a predator, waiting for his moment. I'd been too young to understand what I was seeing at the time, but now I knew. He was the man in the photos. The man Melissa was scared of. The man still hiding in the shadows of my memories. When I called the detective who had worked on Melissa's case all those years ago, I got voicemail. He'd retired and moved away, leaving behind a mountain of files that no one had touched in decades. I managed to get access to the old case file through a friend in the department. And as I flipped through the brittle pages, I found notes on Carl Matthews. He had been questioned extensively, but there was never enough evidence to hold him. No witnesses, no physical proof, just the cold stare of suspicion that never turned into conviction. And then, buried in the margins, I found a single note scrawled in pencil. Strong lead. Subject refuses to cooperate fully. Possible psychological issues. Under surveillance. The word surveillance made my blood run cold. Unless family, or the police, or someone else been watching Carl all along. Had they known he was dangerous, but kept silent? And if so, why? Why let a monster walk free? I started digging deeper into Carl's past. His records showed he'd lived in several towns before moving to ours. Each time leaving after a series of strange incidents, children disappearing, animals found dead, neighbors complaining of strange noises at night. No arrests, no charges, just silence. It's a kind of silence that hides terrible things. One night, as I was scrolling through old newspapers online, I stumbled on a story from one of those towns, a small article about a man named Carl Matthews who had been accused of stalking children, but was released due to lack of evidence. Details were chillingly familiar. The description matched the man I had seen. The pattern matched the fears Melissa had whispered. My hands trembled as I read, my mind spinning with questions and anger and fear. Why had no one told us? Why had no one connected the dots? I started to understand that the neighborhood's peaceful surface had been cracked wide open by something dark and dangerous all along. And we had just been pretending it wasn't there. That night, I sat alone with the box of memories, the letter, the photo, the hair clip band. I wondered if Melissa had known the truth. She had seen Carl for what he really was and had tried to fight back in the only way she could, by leaving clues, by sending messages, by hoping someone would find her story and finish what she started. The thought chilled me to my core, but it also gave me purpose. I wasn't going to let her story end in silence. Not again. Somewhere out there, Carl Matthews was still alive, still hiding, maybe still watching. And I was going to make sure his name was spoken aloud, finally, so he couldn't disappear into the shadows anymore, because Melissa deserved justice, and I needed to know the truth. The next few days felt like walking through a fog, where every familiar street corner, every tree-lined sidewalk suddenly seemed to hide secrets just beneath the surface. I started talking to people, old neighbors, classmates, anyone who might. Remember Melissa or the Matthews family? At first, most didn't want to talk, smiled politely and changed the subject, or told me the case was closed and it was best to let it go. But then, slowly, little pieces started to come together. A neighbor told me about strange noises she heard late at night back then, whispers and footsteps that never belonged to anyone she could see. Another said he once saw a man lurking near the park, just standing there, watching the kids play. When I mentioned Carl Matthews, some faces tightened and the smiles disappeared. One woman, who had been close with Melissa's mother, whispered that Carl had been different and no one really knew what he was capable of. The stories weren't loud, but they were everywhere, like a low murmur beneath the surface of the neighborhood's calm, polite facade. I realized that everyone had seen something, heard something, maybe even suspected something, but no one had said anything loud enough to change anything. Fear kept them silent. Fear of Carl. Fear of what might happen if they spoke. Fear of what would be uncovered. I walked past Melissa's old house again one afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting shifting shadows across the porch. The Current family waved as they came home, unaware of the history wrapped in the walls, unaware of the secrets buried beneath the yard. I thought about Melissa's message underneath the box I'd found under the tree, and I wondered if there was more hidden beneath the surface. That night, I went back to the shed. The front door was still crooked, the wood worn and dark. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, waiting. I circled the shed, looking for any signs fresh dirt, disturbed, ground something out of place, but it all looked untouched, like it had been for years. I thought about the shape I'd seen sitting inside that corner months ago, and I wondered if it was still there, if the darkness inside the shed was waiting for me to come back. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. Just a cat slinking through the bushes, eyes glowing in the night. My heart slowed, but the unease lingered. I realized then that the neighborhood wasn't just haunted by the past, it was haunted by what people refused to see, by the silence and the secrets, by the things left unsaid. I knew I had to keep digging, keep asking questions, keep peeling back the layers, because Melissa's story wasn't just about a missing girl. It was about all of us, about the way we protect each other, or don't, the face of darkness. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finally bringing the shadows into the light. In the weeks that followed, I found myself pulled deeper into the past. Like the neighborhood's silence was a heavy weight I couldn't shake, pressing down on my chest with every step I took. I started visiting the local library and historical society, digging through old records, photographs, and police reports, desperate to uncover anything that might explain how a man like Carl Matthews could slip through the cracks for so long, and how Melissa's disappearance was just one thread in a much larger, darker tapestry. There were stories I'd never heard before about other children who had vanished or gone missing in towns where Carl had lived. Strange sightings of a man lurking near playgrounds and neighbors who moved away suddenly, never to return. Peace felt like a whisper in the dark, a secret waiting to be told. I also found mentions of a strange pattern of burned down sheds and abandoned outbuildings scattered across the places Carl had lived. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but the more I read, the more I realized those fires were suspiciously timed, always after a child went missing, always wiping away any chance of finding clues. It was as if someone or something was trying to erase its tracks. The thought made my skin crawl, and I wondered if the shed behind Melissa's house might have been spared by LaCour, maybe because she left that message, that photo, that letter hidden underneath the tree like a beacon in the darkness. One afternoon, I met with an elderly woman named Agnes who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years. She was small and quiet, but when I showed her Melissa's photo and mentioned Carl Matthews, her eyes darkened and she hesitated before speaking. Agnes told me about a night decades ago when she heard a child crying near the edge of the woods, a sound so desperate it had haunted her dreams ever since. She said she'd looked outside but didn't see anyone, only shadows shifting in the trees and a man's voice whispering something she couldn't understand. It was Carl, she said softly, though no one ever said his name out loud. We were all afraid. We thought if we spoke it, he'd come for us too. Her words echoed the silence I'd come to know, the silence that had protected him and hidden the truth for years. That night, driving home, I felt the weight of that fear settle over me like a thick fog. The neighborhood wasn't just a place where Melissa vanished. It was a place where fear ruled, where people turned away from the darkness instead of facing it. And that darkness had left scars in the families, on the children, and on the very ground beneath our feet. I wondered if Melissa's message was a call to break that silence, to shine a light on what had been buried for so long. If so, then I was ready to answer. I wasn't sure what came next or how far I was willing to go, but I knew one thing. The past wasn't finished with me yet, and neither was Melissa. One evening, as I was sifting through more old boxes in my attic, hoping to find anything that might give me a clearer picture of those lost years, my hand brushed against a dusty, forgotten VHS tape labeled simply with Melissa's name in faded handwriting. My heart skipped, and I almost didn't want to watch it. Paul to know was stronger than the fear of what I might see. I dug out my old VCR and hooked it up to the TV, the familiar worry sound of the tape loading filling the silent room like a ghost from the past coming back to life. The footage was grainy, sometimes shaky, cool, but unmistakably from the summer of 1996. It started innocently enough home videos of birthday parties, school picnics, kids running through sprinklers, but then it changed. There were clips I'd never seen before, scenes taken from angles that made me realize someone had been filming Melissa specifically, watching her closely, almost obsessively. I saw her playing in the yard, looking over her shoulder as if she sensed she was being followed. There was a moment where the camera zoomed in on the shed, the dark doorway just visible behind her. And I swear the person filming's breathing was audible, shallow, intense. As the tape played on, the atmosphere shifted. The cheerful sounds of laughter faded into uneasy silence, broken only by distant footsteps or a door creaking. In one clip, Melissa was inside the house, talking softly to someone off camera maybe. The person filming, but her voice was muffled, and I couldn't make out the words. At one point, she looked directly at the camera, her eyes wide with fear, almost pleading. The final minutes of the tape were the hardest to watch. The footage showed Melissa walking toward the shed, hesitating at the door, as if debating whether to enter. She clutched something small in her hand, maybe the metal tin I found later. Then the tape cut to static, followed by a few seconds of darkness before abruptly ending. I sat there, staring at the screen, long after the tape stopped, my mind racing, with questions and dread. Who was filming her? Why had this tape been hidden away? And most terrifying of all, what had happened in those last moments. I felt like I'd been handed a glimpse into a nightmare no one else had seen, a secret that had been buried in silence for too long. The tape was more than just home videos. It was a record of fear of a child trapped and watched by someone who wanted to control her story, someone who wanted her to disappear without a trace. I knew then that I had to find out who had recorded those tapes and what they might have known. Maybe they were still out there, still holding pieces of the truth, and maybe, if I could reach them, I could finally bring Melissa's story out of the shadows, where it belonged. That night, after watching the tape, I barely slept. The images of Melissa walking toward the shed haunted my mind. The silence between the scenes, louder than any noise I'd heard before. Around midnight, a sharp knock at my front door jolted me upright. My heart thudded as I peered through the peephole, expecting nothing, but saw an unfamiliar figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, his face partly hidden under the brim of a worn hat, his eyes catching the dim porch light just enough to reveal a tired but determined look. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack, voice barely a whisper, asking who he was. "I'm here about Melissa," he said quietly, his voice rough. I knew her. I knew what happened. My breath caught, and despite every instinct, screaming for caution, I let him in. He introduced himself as Daniel, once a neighbor who had left the area shortly after Melissa vanished. Over the next hours, he told me things I hadn't heard before, stories about Carl Matthews, the strange behavior he exhibited, and how a few people had quietly suspected him for years but were too afraid to speak out. Daniel revealed that he'd been secretly collecting information, trying to piece together what the police overlooked, and that he had evidence, documents, photographs, even recordings that could reopen the case. I listened, the room heavy with the weight of years lost and secrets uncovered. He showed me a folder thick with newspaper clippings, old police memos, and a list of other disappearances with eerie similarities. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that Melissa's case was far from isolated, was part of something much bigger. As dawn approached, Daniel handed me a small tape recorder, telling me it contained a confession recorded years ago, but never handed over to authorities. "This might be the key," he said, eyes locking onto mine, "but be careful. There are people who don't want this truth to come out." After he left, I sat alone, the recorder heavy in my hand. The silence was different. Now, not just empty, but charged, filled with the echoes of all the stories left untold. I realized that Melissa's disappearance had opened a door I couldn't close. Ken, whatever waited on the other side, was watching, waiting for me to step through, and I was ready to find out what lay beyond. That night, with the tape recorder in my hands, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room. The silence, thick and heavy around me. I pressed play, the mechanical whir breaking the quiet, and a rough, tired voice filled the room. The man speaking was neither young nor old, his tone flat but laced with exhaustion, regret, and something darker beneath the surface. He began by naming himself Carl Matthews. My breath caught as he confessed to watching Melissa, stalking her for months, describing in chilling detail how he would wait until nightfall to creep near her house, how he felt a twisted sense of control and power in the shadows, spoke of the box hidden beneath the tree, of the messages she left, and of his growing fear that she was close to exposing him. Tape went on, and the words grew darker, revealing a plan he'd carried out in desperation, how he had lured Melissa into the shed, how he had tried to silence her cries, how the guilt haunted him every day since. But what shook me the most wasn't just the confession, it was the final lines, where he whispered that Melissa was still alive, held somewhere far away, and that he feared someone else had taken over the role of watching, waiting. The tape ended abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I sat frozen, the weight of those words pressing down like a storm cloud. The police had never had this tape, and now I held the key to a truth no one else dared to face. But with that truth came a chilling realization. The nightmare wasn't over. The darkness had passed from one hand to another, and somewhere, out there, Melissa's story was still being written. I knew then that my search was far from finished. It was just beginning. The confession tape shattered any remaining illusion I had about closure. Carl Matthews was no longer just a shadow in the background of old photographs or a whispered suspicion in a forgotten neighborhood. He was real, dangerous, and deeply entwined with Melissa's fate. But his final words about someone else taking over the role of watching, waiting, gnawed at me more than anything else. It was as if the story I thought I was uncovering was only a chapter in a much longer, darker book. After that night, I became obsessed with tracing every thread I could find about similar disappearances in nearby towns, looking for patterns that might lead me to this new, unknown figure. What I found was chilling. There were reports, some vague, others detailed, of strange men seen lurking near playgrounds and schoolyards in the years following Melissa's disappearance. Parents whispered about feeling watched. Children reported seeing someone strange in the shadows. There was no name attached, no arrest, just a growing sense of unease that stretched across county lines and state borders. It was like a dark wave, moving slowly but surely, shifting locations, but never disappearing. I started contacting families of other missing children, hoping to build a network of shared knowledge, stories, and maybe clues. Some answered with suspicion, others with gratitude. Many were still haunted by silence, by the same fear that had gripped my neighborhood all those years ago, the fear of speaking the truth and awakening something worse. One day, a woman named Linda reached out. Her daughter had vanished from a small town just a few hours' drive from mine. She told me about a man fitting the description of the new watcher, someone no one saw clearly but who seemed to always be nearby, always just out of reach. Linda had found strange footprints near her backyard, half buried in mud and pieces of fabric caught on thorny bushes. It's like someone had been there but wanted to be careful not to be noticed. Her story echoed Melissa's fears and mine, and it made me realize this was no longer just a neighborhood secret. It was a nightmare spreading, affecting places I'd never even heard of. As I dove deeper, I began to feel the weight of something watching me back. Strange things started happening, calls from blocked numbers with silence on the other end. Fleeting glimpses of movement outside my windows at night. Emails with no text, just pictures of empty streets taken from the shadows. It was as if the darkness Carl had spoken of had found me. The friend request from Melissa's account remained on my screen, sometimes disappearing, sometimes reappearing like a heartbeat in the night, a reminder that this was no coincidence. One evening, a message arrived. "They're closer than you think?" The words chilled me to my core. I realized that uncovering the truth meant more than just knowing what happened to Melissa. It meant confronting a force that didn't want to be found. It meant facing a legacy of fear that had been passed down through years in towns, hidden in plain sight in the eyes of people no one ever suspected. I thought about the people who had stayed silent for so long, the neighbors, the parents, the police officers, and even myself. What had we been protecting? Who had we been protecting? And at what cost? There was no turning back now. Had crossed a line, and the shadows were moving faster than I could follow. But I also knew something else. Melissa's message wasn't just a cry for help, it was a challenge. Could dare to shine a light into the darkest corners, to speak the names that had been whispered but never said, to refuse the silence that had protected monsters for too long. And I was ready to take that challenge. If Melissa was still out there waiting, watching, hoping, then I owed it to her and to all the others to keep fighting, to keep searching, to never let the shadows win. After everything I had uncovered, I realized the story was far from completed. It was like a shattered puzzle scattered across years and towns, the pieces that didn't quite fit but still hinted at a horrifying whole. I started piecing together what I could from the fragment-sold police reports, witness testimonies, news clippings, and whispered memories from families who had never stopped searching for answers. One common thread kept emerging: the presence of an unseen watcher, a man who seemed to slip through cracks in the system and into the edges of every community. His methods were cruelly clever, waiting in shadows, learning routines, exploiting trust, and his reach was long. The more I dug, the more I realized that Melissa's disappearance was just one of many. There were victims whose names had been forgotten, or worse, never known. I found accounts of children who vanished near wooded areas, others who disappeared without a trace during family gatherings, and some who were found years later, their stories lost in the haze of time and fear. Families had been silenced by threats, by shame, or by the hope that forgetting would make the pain easier. But the truth refused to be buried. I also uncovered disturbing reports of people who had tried to speak out, witnesses who disappeared, tips that were ignored, evidence that vanished mysteriously from files. It was as if the shadowy figure wasn't just lurking in neighborhoods, but had allies, or at least sympathizers, in places where justice should have prevailed. This made me question everything I thought I knew about safety, trust, and community. How many times had we turned a blind eye? How many times had fear or complacency allowed this nightmare to grow? I began to understand that finding Melissa's story meant unraveling a much bigger web of silence and deception, one that stretched beyond the boundaries of my childhood neighborhood and touched lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable, but it also strengthened my resolve. I was no longer just a witness, I was a keeper of these stories, a voice for those who had been silenced. And even as I faced threats and shadows closing in, I knew I couldn't stop. because every piece of the puzzle, no matter how broken, mattered. Every name, every face, every whispered memory deserved to be heard. And I was determined to find the missing pieces, no matter the cost. As the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, I realized the truth was not just about a shadowy figure lurking in the neighborhood or an isolated string of disappearances. It was about the people who had been caught in the web of silence and fear, the families who lived with the unknown, the survivors who carried wounds hidden beneath their quiet smiles, and the community that had chosen to look away for so long. I reached out to more families, old friends of Melissa's, and even strangers, connected through forums and support groups dedicated to missing persons. Their stories poured in some heartbreaking, others filled with rage or quiet resignation. But all of them painted a portrait of loss and resilience that no news headline could capture. There was Maria, whose little brother had disappeared from a nearby town under eerily similar circumstances, and who had spent years fighting to keep his case open despite threats and indifference. There was Tom, a retired teacher who had once witnessed a man loitering near the school grounds and reported it to the authorities, only to be met with suspicion and silence. There was Grace, a woman who lived next door to Carl Matthews in another town years before, and who had seen things no child should ever have to see, but had never spoken up out of fear for her family. Each conversation deepened the complexity of the nightmare. It became clear that this wasn't just the work of one man, but possibly a networking, unspoken, dark alliance that thrived on secrecy, fear, and the willingness of communities to bury their worst nightmares rather than confront them. As I listened, I also found threads of hope, families who refused to give up, who fought back with every ounce of strength they had, who formed bonds across towns to share information and support. I connected with groups organizing searches, advocating for better laws, and demanding accountability from law enforcement agencies that had failed them. My days were consumed by endless calls, emails, and late-night research sessions. But amidst the exhaustion, I felt a growing sense of purpose. I was no longer just chasing a ghost from my childhood, was part of a larger movement to bring light into the darkest corners. But with every step forward, the shadows pushed back harder. Strange things began happening around my phone. Would ring with no caller ID and go silent when I answered. My computer would glitch, files disappearing or corrupting. I'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar cars parked near my home, their drivers watching from behind tinted windows. It was clear that someone or something didn't want these stories to be told. One night, after a particularly long call with a mother whose daughter had gone missing 10 years prior, I found a note slipped under my door. It was handwritten, the message simple but chilling: "Stop digging, or you'll be next." The words froze me in place, but they didn't stop me. If anything, they fueled a fire that had been burning inside me since the day Melissa's friend request appeared on my screen. I knew that speaking out came with risks, but silence was no longer an option, not for me, not for Melissa, and not for all the others whose voices had been stolen. I started documenting everything: conversations, threats, leads, with the hope that if something happened to me, the story would live on. The weight of this responsibility was immense, but it was a burden I was willing to carry. I thought about Melissa every day, the little girl who vanished but never truly disappeared. The girl who sent me that friend request, as if reaching through time and space to say, "I'm still here. Don't forget me." Her courage, even in the face of unimaginable fear, was a beacon in the darkness, and it was that light I clung to as I prepared to face whatever came next, because the shadows had been hiding for too long. It was time for them to be brought into the light. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the biggest obstacle wasn't just the shadowy figure or the tangled web of disappearances, was the silence. The deafening, suffocating silence that had allowed this nightmare to fester and grow for decades. Communities had buried their fears. Police had ignored leads. Families had been left alone to suffer. And the truth had been locked away behind closed doors and hushed conversations. But that silence was starting to break, and with it came a storm of emotions: anger, grief, hope, and a fierce determination to finally confront what had been hidden for so long. I began organizing meetings, bringing together survivors, families, and advocates who had been working quietly in the background for years. The stories they shared were raw and painful tales of loss and resilience, of nights spent searching and days filled with unanswered questions. We pooled our resources, shared documents and photos, and connected dots that had been overlooked by officials and the media. Slowly but surely, a clearer picture emerged, one of a network of predators who exploited the cracks in our society. A system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable, and a legacy of fear that had silenced too many voices. We decided to take our fight public, creating a website dedicated to the cases and stories that had been forgotten or ignored. We collected testimonials, posted updates, and reached out to journalists who were willing to shine a light on the darkness. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from all over the country, people who had lost loved ones, who had seen something but were too afraid to speak, who wanted to help break the cycle of silence, but exposing the truth came with risks. Threats became more frequent and more direct. My personal life was invaded, strangers showing up near my home, strange phone calls in the middle of the night. My social media accounts hacked and manipulated. The pressure was immense, but every message from a family who found hope, every story shared, reminded me why I had to keep going. One night, during a particularly heated meeting, a woman named Sarah shared her story. Her sister had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances, and Sarah had spent her life searching for answers. But what struck me most was her description of a man who had approached her recently, warning her to stop asking questions. Sarah's courage inspired the group and gave me the strength to push forward, even when the shadows felt closest. Movement grew, so did the scrutiny. Local law enforcement officials who had ignored cases for years started to feel pressure to act. Some old files were reopened, witnesses were re-interviewed, and new investigations were launched. It wasn't perfect, and progress was slow, but it was a starter crack in the wall of silence. Throughout it all, Melissa's memory was my guide, a friend request, the box under the tree, the tape, and the chilling confession. They were all pieces of a story that needed to be told. And now, with so many voices joining together, that story was finally being heard. The shadows still lingered, and I knew they always would. But the silence was breaking, and with it came the promise of justice, healing, and hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in decades, it felt like we were moving toward the light dot after years of searching, of uncovering truths buried beneath layers of fear and neglect. The story that began with a friend request from a vanished girl was finally reaching its turning point. The weight of silence was breaking, and the light was starting to seep through the cracks. Melissa's name, once whispered only in shadows, was now spoken aloud by families, advocates, and communities determined to refuse the darkness any longer. The website we created had grown into a beacon for those who had suffered in silence, a place where stories were shared, voices were heard, and hope was rekindled. With each new tip and piece of evidence, old cases were reopened and long-forgotten files dusted off. Investigations that had stalled were being pushed forward with new urgency, and in some places, arrests were made, giving families a long-awaited sense of justice. The path was not easy. There were setbacks, threats, and moments when the darkness seemed poised to swallow everything whole. But the community that had come together was stronger than the fear that tried to silence them. Personally, I felt the toll of this journey every day, the sleepless nights, the haunting memories, the constant shadow of danger that lurked just beyond the edges of my life. But Melissa's presence, the friend request that started it all, was a steady flame that kept me going. I visited her old neighborhood often, standing beneath the tree where I found the box, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future. One afternoon, a breakthrough came. A cold case detective reached out, letting me know that new forensic technology had finally linked Carl Matthews and his associates to several disappearances, including Melissa's. DNA evidence, long preserved but unanalyzed, had cracked the case open. The news was bittersweet justice delayed for decades, but finally within reach. Families cried, hugged, and shared stories, grateful for the truth, but mourning the years lost. The confession tape, the photos, the hidden messages, all of it had contributed to a reckoning that no one had expected. And yet, even as justice was served, the scars remained. Communities had to heal, survivors had to rebuild, and the shadow of fear still lingered in some hearts. But what I learned through this journey was that light, once let in, can never be fully extinguished. Melissa's story was no longer just a ghost from the past. It was a call to action, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can be found and silence can be broken. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I know that this isn't just the end of one story, but the beginning of many more. Stories of courage, resilience, and the unyielding human spirit that refuses to let darkness win. Melissa's friend request was more than a message, it was a lifeline, reaching across time to remind us that even when someone vanishes, they can never truly disappear. They live on in memory, in truth, and in the fight for justice that carries on long after the shadows fade. And for that, I am grateful.